Hello, everyone. This is just a sound test. We'll be kicking this off in a minute. It's actually less than a minute. Looks like we're good to go. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much thank you again for showing interest in our Hangouts on our series. And thank you for your time and for joining us this afternoon in the East Coast. We're here today to talk about page speed. As you all know, latency is what users dislike the most when browsing in the web, and half of the users will be abandoning our sites if it takes more than 6-10 seconds to load. So with all that in mind, we're organizing this Hangout to talk about why page speed matters, and also share some of the tools and resources that from Google we can share with you. In order to make this happen, we are really lucky to count with Chiney Tsai. It's one of our technical consultants here at Google. Thank you very much for joining.
It's great to meet everyone here.
We'll be walking us through a deck that he has prepared specifically for this Hangout. As you know, you guys can ask live questions through the Hangout itself. And if for whatever reason you have a problem, you can ask these questions through the Hangout. You can always use the form that we sent over yesterday and that you can see in your calendar invite as well. We acknowledge that sometimes the screen might be a little bit fuzzy. So if you play the Hangout in full screen, hopefully you'll be able to see all the details better. With no further ado, we can kick this off. So I will hand over to Chiney at this point. We will present in the deck, and thank you again for joining. I'm going to be sharing the screen. It's all right, Chiney?
Go for it.
Perfect. We should be presenting now, and now I'm gonna. Where is that? Great, so you all guys should be seeing our deck now.
Yeah, cool. All right, well, thanks everyone for joining in for this Hangouts on Air. As introduced, my name's Chiney Tsai. I work with a lot of publishers here who have websites and apps to kind of optimize their site to be, have high ROI and be a very performant kind of experience for users. So today we're gonna talk about page speed. And some of the things we're gonna cover is kind of baseline why speed matters. Most people agree that they understand, performance, latency, it matters. But we're going to share some of the research that we've kind of collected from the industry and from some internal testing, and then talk about how we as Google kind of approach latency using a real framework, as well as walking through how to audit your sites and some other sites using page speed insights, web page tests, and some of our other tools. Hopefully along the way, we can cover some of the common issues that we see a lot with sites large and small. And if we have some time, we'll open it up to questions at the very end.
And you guys have been sharing with us your preliminary concerns or questions through the registration form. So we really appreciate that. And we have tried to include all those concerns and comments in the deck as well.
So just kick things off, some of you guys probably have seen a lot of coverage in the past year and so saying the mobile web is terrible. There's lots of ads, third parties to things that are kind of fulfilling up the web experience. And New York Times had a prominent article kind of counting the amount of bytes and requests that are kind of bloating some of these web experiences out there. And the truth of the matter is when we polled users, we see that they actually say the thing they care most about a web experience of your product, your brand, isn't that new feature, isn't social sharing, isn't adding to a fancy way of adding to cart. It's just simply slow pages to load. And we see this both asking users directly, we see this in kind of how they react when we give them experiences in kind of A/B testing. And so looking at some of the industry metrics out there, this is a very interesting graph. So on the x-axis, you see load time of the site. And this ranges from anywhere from 1 second to 10 seconds in this case, and can quickly see that the bounce rate of your website can go from 12.8% bounce rate to about 58% bounce rate by just having that loading experience range from 2.4 seconds to 10 seconds. Also, not only that, if your website has some sort of conversions because you sell a product, because you want to go for a email subscription or a newsletter subscription, that conversion rate quickly drops from a 2% around the 2-second mark down to less than 1% once you hit 5 seconds or so. So the truth of the matter is, even a second's difference really does affect some of the business metrics that you might track. Looking at some of our own data in Google Analytics and things like that across the web kind of anonymously, we quickly see some of this in action. We see that some of our sites that kind of go through our network, some load as slow as 19 seconds, some load as fast as 5 seconds. And then kind of correcting for and standardizing some of the data sets and the page views here, you see that a user actually engages way more with the site from when the page experience loads much faster, which makes sense because it creates a mental model for a user where, okay, there's very little cost for me to explore your site, to click on the category page, to click into a news article and jump out of a news article. If your page is slow, they feel like they need to get it right the first time. That they're less likely to try clicking on something for the sake of it, so they feel like they have to be very particular. Same thing for those who serve ads on your website. Then you're worried about ad viewability, and there is a general notion that, well, a faster site might hurt viewability because the ad might not show already. But our data in aggregate actually shows that the faster loading site from 19 seconds to 5 seconds actually sees a higher increase in viewability because you're preventing scenarios where a user or your page requests an ad and the user bounces before the ad is even shown. And so all this data kind of collectively shows that for higher viewability, for more page views, for more ad requests, it really helps to kind of increase that page speed. And this is something that a lot of brands have been looking at for the past year, for the past 5 years. Called out here are Staples, GQ, Walmart, and Netflix. They publish case studies, which we can link to as a follow-up here. But they quickly see that conversions, traffic, all this stuff is mapped to actual work where they make speed and loading time a feature. And that can actually be something that actually maximizes the yield. We spend so much time worrying about how do we increase CPM, how do we increase revenue for our current set of users, holding all things equal. And that might be a very small incremental uplift in terms of business metrics. But really, if you can cut load time by 50% and get to almost doubling your traffic like GQ, then that ceiling can be so much higher. So I think the assumption here, which sets the stage for the rest of our kind of more technical talk, is that page speed is money. And to be more clear, speed is not necessarily one metric. It's not the page speed insight score by itself. It's not going to be load time by itself. But we like to think of speed as the user's perception of friction. A page might take a long time to load and send a signal saying this is 30 seconds. But if the user sees something that's useful to them because they click through search for an article and they're immediately given the headline, the image, the content, they can start engaging, to them, that is much faster. So to help kind of tell that story a little bit better, we have a framework at Google called the Rail Framework. And this is relatively new. There's a Smashing magazine article published by Paul Irish and Paul Lewis on it. And so I encourage you guys to read about it. But it's divided up into 4 parts. The 4 parts are response, animation, idle, load. Today, we'll only concentrate on one of them. But to quickly give an overview, we want a web experience or an app experience for those who have both to follow these 4 guidelines. When a user engages with your product, whether it's clicking directly into your homepage, swiping through a carousel, clicking a share link, you want every single click and interaction for your page to respond immediately. Because if your page takes a second to respond, it's going to be laggy and the user's going to be less likely to interact. And that's going to hurt that session time. It's going to hurt that engagement. Animation. A lot of sites now use fancy animation, whether it's parallax, carousels, interesting kind of infographics that have graphs and things like that. But you want that to be extremely smooth, especially now that users are viewing these experiences largely on their mobile devices. That web experience needs to be as smooth as an app experience. To the user, your brand is just shown on that small mobile screen. They don't care if you're a web page or if you're an app. There's no different standard here. Idle is, a lot of us have a lot of JavaScript on our page, whether it's because we have a single page application, we have a lot of jQuery plugins, we have analytics that we would need to send back to our servers every 10 milliseconds or something like that. What Idle is here is you need to respect your page's ability to respond to a user. A lot of times if your page loads, even though it might be visually complete there's a lot of JavaScript potentially happening in the background that prevents the page from actually doing something. And we've all seen experiences where a page seems to have loaded, we start scrolling, and it seems like that the scroll doesn't actually track with our finger. It's like the page is jumping around, or click something, it's very frustrating as a user. And so there's kind of ways here about sending that information and giving the browser the choice to do it when the user's not actually interacting with your page. Load is going to be the most traditional metrics of performance and speed. Ideally, we recommend that your page is ready to use or perceived ready to use by a user in 1 second. And there's going to be a lot of bits and pieces here. We're going to dive into this a little bit more. So let's talk about load. So going back to the previous graph, where we saw like the conversions and bounce rates ranging from the 2 seconds to 10 seconds, we see that 77 of the top mobile sites actually take longer than 10 seconds to load. The average page load time is 19.1 seconds. And a lot of times I get the question saying, well, that's not true. I'm in my office, I'm connected to the Wi-Fi, and it seems to load instantly. But that doesn't take into account that while you're a developer on the site, it's very likely that you have assets cached, very likely you have fast internet. But the truth of the matter is, when we kind of look at users of the internet as a whole, most people are going to be on slower connections, are not going to be constant visitors to your site. So they're going to be pulling every dependency for the first time. And so there's definitely work to be done here. As part of that, recently, I think just this week, we actually published a different study, which is we threw a lot of machine learning at the concept of page speed and its effect on conversions and bounce rate. And we saw that some of the kind of assumptions that we've been talking about for the past 10 years were kind of validated, and some of the stuff we had to think a little bit more about. But looking at page loads as a whole across millions of website visits, the top predictors of conversion rates were not necessarily just load time by itself. We're not trying to advocate just take load time and advocate and change a number to make that as small as possible. A lot of times it's just looking at specifically what actually goes into your page, the number of elements, the complexity of your page, the number of images. We're moving more and more to a very image and rich media heavy kind of web world where the user actually spends a lot of time looking at a blank page because all the images are almost half a megabyte. And so we want to prevent that kind of bad experience. Even if that very, very end experience where it's completely loaded is beautiful, most of that loading experience is just looking at white blocks. And of course, the number of scripts. Same thing with bounce rate. We're looking at the top three here, maybe the full page load time, again, the complexity, and then by far the idea of DOM load. And DOM load here isn't when the page is fully completely loaded. It means when the page has requested the entirety of the HTML, walked through it and parsed it all so it can start laying out the basic bare bones of the page. And usually that is when the page is mostly ready for the user to start consuming, to start scrolling through and see what's actually there. And so going back to the previous narrative of it's not any one number, it's how fast and how applicable is your experience and loading in its load time to what the user's desire is. And so to optimize for that very top predictor of DOM load, it goes back to a basic concept that we've talked about and published before on the PHP Insights developer resources. It's the critical rendering path. And essentially, this is how quickly your site loads. When the HTML is loaded from your web page. It looks at, JavaScript or styles and various other dependencies. These are all things that prevents the browser from being able to say, oh, I think I have enough information now, let's show something. On the right side, you quickly see an optimized critical rendering path where the browser felt it was okay to start showing things on the page, and therefore the user has confirmation almost immediately that something is happening and that they can quickly see that their search result, their social click-through was validated. They actually went to the place they want to get to. Whereas in the second example, for an unoptimized critical rendering path where the browser's like, you keep sending me more JavaScript, you keep making me wait on styles, so I can't be ready to show anything yet. And so the user ends up seeing a very white page until the 1.5 second mark. And in reality, it's actually far worse than 1.5 seconds. And on paper, the load time for these two experiences might be the same. It might actually both say the page loads in 10 seconds, but these two experiences are obviously not created equal. And so the idea of making sure your narrative and how you view your data in the lens of users is extremely important. Obviously, I don't want to ignore the elephant in the room. Ads, third-party scripts are obviously part of the problem. Most of the time, a lot of the critical rendering path elements are going to be external JavaScript. You work with partners who say, throw this tag into your head, or make sure our script gets loaded and executed before loading the rest of your page. And there's potentially advantages to that, of course, in regards to, say, header bidding or something like that. But you have to take into account that there is always a cost for every single piece of third-party script that you add into your head. And think of it as a performance budget. If you have some sort of budget, if you're about to add a third-party script that's actually blocking your render, perhaps it's a good time to take out something else. It's not there's very limited resources. But this here is looking at kind of a lot of our publisher websites, and we see that in terms of requests being made by a web page, so after that core HTML page is loaded, sometimes a good 50% of those are coming from ads-related third parties. And I challenge you guys to think about, well, how much value are you giving to your users if your analytics and your content is potentially less than the amount of third-party scripts you're plugging into your site? And that's actually kind of part of the argument that the New York Times article we referenced in the first slide was getting into. And so it's worth kind of walking through some of that. So some of the tools we use to diagnose some of these problems, to go deeper into it, are PageSpeed Insights, web page test. For a particular page load, I'll open up Chrome DevTools to do a network analysis, Google Analytics, user timings, and kind of plug into specific code that you can plug into your page and view in your logs. Today, we'll only talk about PageSpeed Insights and web page tests. Simply, we believe that one in your organization that has, who cares about the web experience should be able to run a test on. So PageSpeed Insights, this is one of our more infamous tools. I think we've talked about it for a very long time now, and there are good ways of approaching this and not. For those who don't know, it's a tool you can just go to. I'm not sure what the exact URL is, but you can search PageSpeed Insights. You can drop in the URL, and we automatically look at how that page is following certain rules. And some of these rules are just kind of heuristics of what good symptoms of fast loading websites. Not necessarily that by doing all these things you're perfect, and there are obviously ways to cheat it. And I think for those websites who end up saying, oh, well, we're just going to show a very basic splash screen to get a really, really high score. Well, the only kind of experience with cheating is yourself. But as you can see in the screenshot here, some of the things that it checks for, like eliminate render blocking JavaScript, leverage browser caching, optimize images, they're pretty basic rules. Clicking on show how to fix tells you exactly what those JavaScript and CSS files are actually blocking your page from rendering. And so that very first part here is what I would focus my core attention to, is can we make that should fix into at least a considered fixing? The score here ranges from 0 to 100. Traditionally, when we look at our publishers that we work with, most sites fall under the kind of 40 to 55 range. We believe that this can be far better. And so we've been taking kind of the idea of speed here, of raising this goal to be much higher. That being said, we've also seen organizations where the only goal is to try to get 100. And I would caution kind of to say, use this as a best practices guide to look at, the specific suggestions, to look at specific resources that get called out in the critical rendering path. And the difference between an 80 and 100 isn't actually much more. It's not a linear kind of advantage to, your bounce rates or conversions or SEO or anything like that. But having a higher score is going to be better. Obviously, the score of the tool only looks at a particular web page. The user experience that you may have for your site, whether you're a retailer, whether you're a news site, may be a bit different. And this effect is compounding. When the user comes in through search, a low page speed score will hurt that experience, but then they might want to click on something else, and then something else, and then something else. And so you gotta look at this entire experience as a whole and average that out. So even having one kind of bottleneck of one page, maybe your static pages are extremely fast, but you have a dynamic loaded page in the middle for search results that for some reason takes a very, very long time. That's going to be the bottleneck of your experience. And that's something to think about when you're auditing your own sites. It is possible to score highly. Some of you guys have heard about the Accelerated Mobile Pages project that we've been working on with the community for the past year or so. And this is an example of the Verge, commonly looked at in terms of perf audits and I think unfortunately made fun of sometimes of having a low page speed. And you can see that their AMP page actually performs really well. 85 out of 100 versus their regular page of 51 out of 100. AMP has ads built into it. The user interface and the styles here are actually very similar to their actual core destination site. Obviously, not all the functionality is there quite yet, and the AMP team and the community is working very hard on building more components to make those features have parity between the two experiences. But then there are things that AMP does very well that you can do too to add to your site. And some of these are, going back to the critical rendering path, is number one, don't have synchronous scripts that block your page from loading. You don't necessarily need that jQuery plugin for calendar to load before anything shows on your page. That can be something that kind of comes into your page later on. So load everything you can asynchronously. Have static resources. Keep third-party JS out of the critical path, again, through asynchronous scripting. The screenshots you saw beforehand, you can get really, really close to that styling with a much, much smaller payload of CSS. Small enough potentially that instead of making an additional HTTP request, you can inline that CSS directly into your HTML and then load additional CSS later on as the document is loading. And look at prioritization of things that are above the fold, because the way AMP pages load, it completely prioritizes loading in just the things that are above the fold or within one scroll. There's no need to necessarily worry about loading things that a user might do 5 seconds in or scroll to 3 seconds in. To the user, if they see that above the fold instantly, that is speed to them, and that's going to be what's affecting that bounce rate. So I talked about this previously, which is the reason that some of the data we were collecting earlier had page speed times going from 3 seconds all the way to 20 seconds. It's because we use 3G as a baseline. Even though we live in a world where 4G is prevalent, a lot of your friends potentially have 4G connections. Those 4G connections a lot of times are connecting at 3G speeds. And research shows that this is going to be the predominant kind of connection speed for a good amount of users. And so this is going to be the baseline for kind of what we use for our tests. So the other tool we look at is web page tests, and you can go to this at webpagetest.org. It's a great tool for getting more specific metrics about the site. If PageSpeed Insights checks to see if you're following some best practices and kind of looking at specific elements of your page, web page tests kind of does a full load of your page and gives you even more granular numbers, like the moment a pixel starts rendering on your page, the speed index, the how many DOM elements, and then more traditional metrics like load time, DOM complete, and so forth. So in this case, I'm using NBC News as an example here. That we kind of chose a scenario of using a Motorola G, which finds a very good middle-of-the-road kind of mobile phone to look at performance. We use Chrome and then use 3G fast. The 3G fast here, remember, it's not just the amount of bandwidth, not just the amount of bytes you can push through. A mobile connection also means that when you're about to connect to a new server, your CDN or a third-party server, that handshaking to make that connection also has a higher cost, which is why you're going to see a much larger effect on your performance and speed if you have a lot of requests to new third parties and a lot of servers, things like that. When you run the test by throwing in a URL, whether it's your home page or an article page, you get a report that has this table at the very top. To quickly walk through the things that I look at when I audit the site, I look at speed index first and foremost. Speed index is a value that tries to guess the visually completeness of your site. And so and this is loosely matches to about milliseconds or so. So in this case, speed index for the NBC News homepage here is 12,845. And what that means is that a user perceives this page as being visually complete in about 12 seconds. And even if it's a repeat view where because they click on an article after going to the homepage or coming back to the homepage, you think that things are cached, images are cached, dependencies are cached, but that's still potentially taking up to 9 seconds. So going back to the previous kind of conversion chart, most of those, there's an opportunity here of taking that 9 seconds perceived latency down to even half of that, 4 seconds, that will greatly decrease the amount of attrition and exits from your site. The DOM elements here there's a lot. There's potentially ways of reducing the amount of complexity here. And we find this to be a key contributing factor to conversions and bounce rate. And then the amount of requests is also pretty high, largely due to third parties from before. I would guess that maybe about half of these are going to be ad calls, third parties, and things like that. I'm not saying not to make those calls, but remember there is a cost here for every additional piece that might affect your total number of users approaching your site. So another feature of web page tests is the film strip view. And the film strip view is really cool because it kind of gives you that story. Instead of looking at when the page is totally loaded and trying to sum it up into one number, whether it's a 10-second load time, a 12,000 speed index, it actually tells you the whole story going from 0 seconds to, in this case, 50 seconds. And that 50 seconds is when the user potentially pulls out their phone and they see the loading bar, the blue bar on the top. And I don't know about you guys, but when I pull out a phone and I click on a link and I see that blue bar moving for forever, I'm probably going to leave, or I'm just extremely frustrated. I'm not going to have a good impression of your page. And so in this case, web page test allows you to compare your own site, compare it to your competitors, or compare your site to different parts of your site. And you can see how different pages here actually load in. The abcnews.go.com here doesn't do a progressive render. The page shows white until about 15 seconds, and then loads everything at once. So this is a key kind of example of a page that hasn't really looked at the critical rendering path necessarily, so that the browser doesn't exactly know if it has all the JavaScripts it needs, it has all the styles it needs, so it doesn't show anything until that 15-second mark. While CNN does a little bit better job. It quickly confirms to the user, well, not quickly, it's still at 10 seconds, but it at least confirms to the user that you're at CNN politics, you got to where you want to be, and then slowly brings in some of the information. To kind of convert that film strip into a graph here, this is a visual progress graph. And so the speed index metric we were looking at before tries to sum up this graph into one metric. Every color line here maps to a different web page. The symptoms of the way I want to talk about this is that there are good curves here and there are bad curves. You want a curve that is more like the orange line, which is potentially it shows everything really, really fast. It's going to be better for that orange line to be closer to 0 seconds, but it got to visual completeness pretty quickly and pretty smoothly. But if you look at, say, the blue line, that shows or the purple line, it potentially shows a problematic loading sequence where it's very jagged. It seems to load and gets to its completed state about like at 60%, but then it moves up and down from that completed state until it finally reaches 100%. This is the blue line, 100% at 24 seconds. And so what this kind of describes to a user is that, oh, look, the page seems to load in 2.7 seconds. I can start reading or doing something. And you start reading a paragraph, and then an ad pops in, or a jQuery plugin initializes, and things move around. And that's that layout kind of jank or disruptive rendering. It's really, really harmful to your user experience because that leads to misclicks. Maybe they didn't want to click out of your site, but they accidentally clicked something to where they didn't want to go. Maybe they're just frustrated and they don't want to engage with your site anymore. Like, I'm just gonna finish this article. I'm just gonna leave because it's just kind of not a good experience. And with purple, the issue here is that, it's not as jagged, but it gets to about 40%. And let's take a look at the MSNBC one. In that, it gives you a steady state for a very, very long time, and it changes the page almost completely at 40 seconds. So you kind of see that at the end here, which is, for whatever reason, that image then suddenly became this subscription kind of piece, which is also a different size potentially from the main image, moving things around again. And so that's potentially frustrating. And so I think the cool thing about some of the critical rendering path and the film strip analysis is that it's not necessarily just saying your site is perfect and just third parties, once they're gone, the site's going to load fast. I think there's a lot of work to be done in both optimizing for third parties. The Chrome team is working hard at creating APIs to minimize the effects that third parties can do to your site. And so look for that in the latest versions of Chrome. We're working on the disruptive rendering parts so that when you do scroll down and are locked into a paragraph and something loads in because an ad expands, it doesn't actually move the user away from the paragraph that they're reading. So there are things that the browser can do, but there are also a lot of things that your core site can do to optimize for that loading experience. And so this is an example of that. NBC News here, one of the other features of web-based tests allows you to load a page while avoiding making a certain call. And so we looked at loading the exact same page with GPT and without GPT for ad loading. And the loading experience in the film strip actually are practically identical. The main issues that came out was that, GPT was loaded asynchronously. The reason the page took 2 seconds to show anything, that was something with regards to their critical rendering path. It's the kind of the JavaScript that gets loaded initially that blocks the page from loaded. It's their own first-party kind of JavaScript that move things around, and so that's going to create potentially that kind of jank you might see on the page. Looking at a specific industry here, this is retail and e-commerce, and we just arbitrarily took a few of the websites here, and you can quickly see that the very first example here, Macy's. This particular version doesn't have ads, but the speed index is extremely high. I think I can't really see the seconds here, but I believe it's like about 9 seconds or so. Oh, sorry, 6 seconds or so before something shows up on the page. And so the speed index is high. But then Amazon, Target, Walmart, eBay, these actually have ads kind of loaded on their page, have a much lower speed index. And then part of the reason that tells me what the difference is here is that blocking scripts in the very first example are going to be the main kind of opportunity to increase speed. And if Amazon, a retailer with very specific kind of functionality, can potentially load that initial view with almost no JavaScript, maybe again pushing that point home, maybe you don't need to load a social plugin JavaScript the moment the site loads. Maybe you don't need to load that calendar widget or something like that, because those are going to be things that are going to slow down your total page speed. So the idea here is concentrate on the critical rendering path. You want to load fast, but you also want to load less. When you do a Chrome DevTools kind of analysis, and you load up your site, open up Chrome DevTools, and you do a fresh load to look at the network waterfall, you want this waterfall to be skinny. So this is an example of a website this is Hilton here, that loads fast because all the elements that they depend on, they respond relatively quickly. 484 milliseconds. There's not any one script that they depend on that's going to take a long time. Granted, there's going to be cases where your server is overloaded, your CDN is just responding slower, and if one of these resources does take a long time, that's going to push that first paint from happening, that first contentful paint. But the other issue here is you want to load less. Maybe there shouldn't be 23 scripts that are preventing your page from showing something. A lot of these scripts here can be concatenated. They can be just loaded after the page has done a first initial load, such as, again, the date picker, some retriever. A lot of sites I see use jQuery, not necessarily for cross-browser compatibility or for more advanced usage, but a lot of times sites use jQuery just for the $ selector. And you can write actually your own kind of one-line function to use a $ selector without actually loading and depending on yet a different third-party script. So one of the recommendations that we can quickly make then from that is concatenate your own JS files, load things after, and for your third-party scripts that are inside that initial kind of waterfall, do it asynchronously. Have it so that the browser can kind of schedule the request separately from the main parser of your HTML. And then when the third-party JavaScript does get in, it will kind of get executed automatically based off of that, instead of blocking your script and your HTML from doing something automatically. And if absolutely needed, you can use a script defer to quickly say, load the JavaScript as fast as possible, but hold off on executing it and changing things on your page until your core priority of loading your content is done, and then do the execution afterwards. So in terms of kind of jumping a step back here, which is what are the usual suspects of mobile performance? So this is taking a look at a ton of sites out there, and honestly, some of the stuff that PageSpeed Insights recommends continue to be top problems of a lot of websites out there. Images are 63% of an average page's total weight. There are so many times where your core images, maybe like an icon, things like that, might be optimized. But for news websites, for sites that work with an editorial team or have other people on the team who kind of upload their own content, a lot of times those images aren't optimized. So you can quickly find instances where there's a 5 MB image trying to load into a mobile-sized viewport. You're sending way more pixels than is necessary, and that's going to prevent a page from being useful or being complete to a user. And I think this is a fallacy where we often look at a design for the finished version of a page, and it's beautiful, but that finished version of the page doesn't get to show to the user for a good 40 seconds, then who gets to appreciate that beauty? A lot of pages have way more than 100+ resource requests. Consider looking at a budget here, saying my page load should not exceed X amount of requests. And for a business, for whatever business reason, a partner you work with, you want to add an additional request into that waterfall, you can do that, but make sure it's not at the cost of a performance budget. Look at your JavaScript usage, try to concatenate it, remove things that you don't actually need. There's an awesome plugin called Ghostery that you can kind of drop and add to your Chrome browser that quickly looks at your site to see what are the third parties that are being executed in the background of your site. So many times I've run it, shown it to a publisher, and they're like, oh, we actually stopped using X vendor or Y service, but why is that tag still there? And a lot of times it's because they just forgot to remove it. And it's actually doing harm to your site if you forget to remove things like that. So that's going to be useful. So in terms of a good takeaway, the general recommendation at this point is to continue running PageSpeed Insights, use web page test. Right now, at the current point, to snapshot your website. Look at the score, look at some of the metrics we talked about before in terms of load time, the number of requests, speed index, and then make performance a feature. Users consider that a core part of their experience, and that should be something that gets scheduled into your sprints and not just like a cleanup feature. And then check again in a month or a quarter to see if these metrics improve. And every time you're about to do a release, look back at the effects on these two numbers, because if it increases it, maybe it's not ready to be deployed quite yet. So that's all I got in terms of some of content. And so I think we have about 20 minutes or so for questions. So I think looking at the first question, I think in the chat, there is why is very fast load time displaying a higher bounce rate? And so we're talking about that, the first graph we saw where it wasn't just like a straight curve saying if the page loads at 0 seconds, it's, the user stays forever. We believe that's because a lot of times if a page seems to load instantly, like within 0 seconds or 0.5 seconds, it's partially because it's a 404 page, the page was blank, or something like that, where it just wasn't what the user was looking for. And that's why the user's going to leave, because that's not what they're looking for. And I think it actually shows that every feature, every piece of content we put into the site, that's important too. And there's a balance of that with how fast the usefulness actually shows up. So it becomes this kind of push-pull thing with features and performance.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Sinead. That was just amazing.
Thank you.
Okay, there are more questions here that we can ask them all as you guys ask them. So, I mean, if you want to go over these ones.
Here's another one. I think, how does page speed influence ranking? So we can't advise too much on ranking for obvious reasons. I will say that it's never going to be one metric, right? Don't take load time, don't take page speed and then just say this is the holy grail and optimize this and it's like a linear all else follows when it comes to ranking. Look at the actual effect on your site and the actual user narrative of how the page loads in, what the final state is, and how the user can interact with it.
Quick question, quick thing before we continue. Someone, I think Joel is asking about how are we going to be archiving these presentation. We are going to be sending the recording to all of you guys at the end of the maybe tomorrow or the day after, so you will have the recording, okay, together with the deck and other resources.
Cool. Next question is, do you recommend doing responsive design between all devices or responsive on desktop, tablet, and a separate site for a smartphone? This is an interesting question. I think a lot of people want to hear, say, always do a responsive site or always do an M.dot only. I think there's advantages and pros and cons to both. Facebook, for example, does a M.dot site, and they do so because it's a very core destination. They want that kind of M.dot site to be fully featured product, and so that works for them. But they're willing to pay the cost. So an M.dot site a lot of times has a redirect, and that redirect, it might be you type in www.mysite.com, the server says you're a mobile user agent, you should actually go to M.dot something. That's going to be potentially a 1 second redirect. And so are you willing to pay that 1 second cost of having that exit rate or speed to affect your site? And maybe that cost is worth it because with an M.dot site, you can work faster. You can have a separate developer team that has a stripped down, more core version of your page, but that's going to be more resources potentially. It could be less resources depending on how you're organized. And so you have to make sure that experience is specific for mobile and it's actually adding value. But for most people, we're going to recommend that go with a responsive site because you don't need to pay that upfront cost, and you only need to make one version of your page. It seems like a lot of scripts processing goes into responsive efforts. So, and that's true. I think the problem with responsive at the moment is that we've moved from a desktop-only world of web development to a mobile-inclusive world. Everyone likes to think that they're mobile first. But the truth is, most responsive sites are done in a way where the scripts are there because they're catering to that desktop experience. And they simply say, load everything, but just don't show it on a mobile responsive site. So I'll consider, it takes a bit more work, but having some sort of adaptive experience where you don't actually need to load something. You can detect if the user is is in what context, and then load something afterwards instead of saying loading everything at once. Do you recommend using Chrome Canary as we develop? Chrome DevTools is extremely powerful, even in kind of the base release. Most of the features in there are not utilized enough by developers, I think. Problem with using Chrome Canary exclusively is that things might seem broken. Things might seem like they're working fine, and that's not going to be what your core user is looking at. If anything, I would encourage you to switch up your development cycle. So you sometimes use Chrome, sometimes use Firefox, sometimes use Safari, because there's been so many instances of sites who work best in Chrome because the development team only works in Chrome. So working exclusively in Chrome Canary could exacerbate some of those issues. But there are going to be kind of certain features and experimental factors and tools that are only available in Chrome Canary. So for example, we have another tool that we didn't talk about today called Lighthouse. Lighthouse is a great tool in development to help you kind of build progressive web apps. And that right now is only available in Chrome Canary, but that will eventually be available for normal Chrome. I recently read Google is bringing AMP technology to ads. What does that really mean, and what are the implications? So again, AMP is a subset or a restricted set usage of HTML. And I think one of the really cool things we saw from the initial rollout is that by reducing the amount of ways that a developer can mess up or ruin performance by restricting the things you can do, you can create really, really fast sites. So many ads now are more than just images. A lot of times it's a HTML5 document, and that has the same issues potentially as a website. So it's a very, very simple kind of move to say, well, can we take the same restrictive principles and the same learnings of creating extremely fast but beautiful, well-styled experiences for web pages and make that available for ads? Because we have that guarantee that an HTML5 document that is traffic as an ad is following a certain set of rules, like an AMP page, then it doesn't necessarily need to be sandboxed in an iframe because there's less of a question mark. It can be cached and served through the AMP cache, very similar to that web page. And so I think, let me just jump over to the slides real quickly again. This was, I think you can find a article on this guy online, but this is an example of some of the things we're thinking about in terms of AMP for ads and how that compares to a non-AMP for ads experience. So this AMP article loads up, and you see on the right side, the ad loads practically instantly. And it's partially because we're kind of working with advertisers and such to say, you can also build extremely performant ad experiences that are also following the same rules we're now advocating publishers kind of adhere to.
Great. So I think there's one last question. Do we have to consider different connection speed in different geos?
Yeah, I mean, when I do analysis, I do it kind of looking at, well, I sit in the US, so I look at kind of US-based traffic that goes by that research. If you're looking at a site that your main demographic is in Asia, in Brazil, in developing nations or something like that, then when you go to web page test, don't just pick 3G fast, pick a location that matches or that's close to where your server content might actually be coming from, as well as the expected network speed. You want to get that as close as possible. There never is going to be like a one answer for all sites. I'm not going to use a Washington location at 3G fast when I'm looking at a site that's mostly visited by Japanese users in Tokyo, for example. And those web page test numbers will be different if you do so.
Well, we have another question here. Google is excluding Flash ads from AdSense and AdX in Jerry. Is there a way to exclude Flash ads only in the AdX UI in the meantime?
That question, I haven't looked at it honestly recently, so we need to follow up on that one.
Always follow up with your account manager guys on those questions that we're not able to solve at this point.
Well, AMP is interesting. It would cause us to lose money. Header bidding, for instance, would not work to my knowledge. Any thoughts on this? I think people quickly assume that by having less knobs and whistles because AMP restricts the things you can do with ads, then you'll lose money. I think initial tests here might say to hold off necessarily on making a broad assumption there, because having that faster page speed, we're showing that there's higher viewability, there's potentially higher click-throughs because it reduces the user kind of tendency to say, I don't want to click on anything. Like I was saying earlier, I can only click on the exact thing I want because everything else, well, I'll pay a high cost. So AMP removes that kind of barrier to just even clicking on a third-party ad, coming back, switching between articles. And so the total narrative might actually have higher yields. And so right now we're actually seeing pretty positive numbers there.
Cool. I think that was the last question in our live Hangout, but we had a few questions that we got in our preliminary registration form that I would like to go over. We tried to cover all through the deck, and it's fantastic presentation, by the way. But it's just to reiterate a couple of aspects. We're wondering about third-party code affecting our page speed score, specifically at networks and verify services. So to close the loop in the
so a lot of times people look at the page speed insights report, and this is specifically going to be in the reduce effects of caching or whatever that role is, and they say, hey, a lot of these things I depend on are getting dinged on are third parties, and I think that's a good thing. In terms of, we're not creating a tool that ignores Google scripts. We're not creating a tool that ignores third parties and only look at your own code, because at the end of the day, the site is your site and you make a choice to include a third party. And we call out kind of our own things that we can improve on. I would also caution that it's not necessarily like always the correct answer. It's a heuristic, it's a rule we check for kind of best practices, but a lot of times, something might show up and it may actually be completely optimized, but that's something for you to check, and PageSpeed Insights creates the opportunity for you to check that. But I just want to stress home the point that it's important to have a performance budget. Everything you add to your page has a cost, and you have to make the calculation of, is the ROI actually worth it, knowing potentially the effects on conversion rate, exit rate, and stuff like that.
Cool. Thank you for that. What do you do about pages that load significantly faster than the ads they display, causing lower viewability scores?
Yeah, so one of the ways we're working on that is the AMP for Ads project, which is to say, well, if AMP is practically instant loading, can we also make the ads instant loading? In the meantime, there are ways to deal with that scenario. For example, having a banner ad at the very top of your page might not actually be the best for viewability, because while, yes, it will be called immediately, a user most likely would have scrolled past that before then. And so, a user always scrolls. That's pretty obvious when we look at kind of user testing. And so to potentially look at, sticking in placements that are in the middle of the feed of the article, and that's going to have a much better experience there. And I think the cool thing about AMP is that a user can start engaging with an article and actually start reading content. They're not just leaving, or they're not just skimming because they only want to spend a minute on the site. And if you spend 50 seconds just loading the site, no ad gets loaded. But now the site gets loaded within 10 seconds, so they can consume content for 40 seconds. Well, once they start reading, they can quickly see ads loaded for that. I think the data we had previously shows that in general, faster sites are going to have higher viewability. And so that's, I think, I question that assumption. That's to say that a user will have a poorer experience because they saw your content faster than your ad. They're seeing something faster, they're happier. So they'll stay longer, basically.
How does a CDN affect the page speed score that we receive? Not all pages are equal, so does a dynamic search results page with 24 results get compared to a static page with content ad that does not change?
Yeah, so the PageSpeed Insights tool, and as far as kind of our purposes, we don't consider a static page or a search results dynamic page or a single page application to be any different. At the end of the day, the user gets there, they have some sort of experience, and it's a trade-off you make. A single page app again, you're willing to load maybe nothing up front, pay the cost of loading that framework, and then have maybe zippy, smooth loading in the future. But that's the cost. Same thing, a static site should have the advantage of being a static site and having everything preloaded than compared to a search results page, which they give up that immediacy of having the exact content for a more potentially personalized or dynamic content. So that's just a trade-off that you have to consider, but there's no reason why the dynamic page should get a pass for that.
Guys, we're almost running out of time. Really appreciate, again, your time and your commitment. And it was great to have so many questions here. Thanks, Chen, again, for all your time and all your knowledge. I think this is very valuable for all our publishers here. And also, please, we encourage you to share that with your teams as well. We'll be sending the recording as well as the deck, partially the deck, and some other resources in our follow-up email that will be, as I said before, sent tomorrow or the day before, the day after. So you will have all the information. Please share that with your developers, the rest of your team, and also follow up with us if you have questions. Follow up with your account manager on PageSpeed. We're really here to help you out to improve, and we'll be also connected with Chinese team very closely to make sure that we help you out in the proper way. So please be vocal with your account manager on that. And we will also be sending, together with the follow-up email, feedback form. Feedback is really important for us. We want to understand what are we doing well and what do you guys like, but mainly what can we improve and what we can do better. So please share your feedback with us. And also in the feedback form, you will find a section that says which topics you see us doing more Hangouts on Air about. So please share that with us as well. It was a pleasure to be here with you for these hours. Thanks, Shana, again, and see you soon. Thank you very much. Bye. Have a nice day.